After all the comments from members of the committee on House File 1054 are exhausted, we will take a vote. A roll call has already been requested. Comments from members of the committee. Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we weren't able to have any discussion around the A1 amendment. And I'm just curious what the deleted language on page 4, what the intent of that was, and why the decision to delete it.
Representative Clark.
Madam Chair, we did discuss it briefly, but I was just thinking maybe a call for the person who's been working with me on that. Well, actually, I think Representative Simon, that was you who worked on that, wasn't it?
Representative Simon.
Representative Holberg, the language was probably a little bit too broad and could have been more specific. There are a lot of different subject matters that this might apply to, and the best approach, at least from my standpoint, would be to go over this subject matter by subject matter, probably in some future bill. But breadth is the primary reason.
Representative Holberg.
Mr. Chair, I'm still not clear what you were trying to protect, or what were you trying to carve out or accomplish that I'm not even understanding what the intent of the language was in the first place, let alone whether it was nuanced in the right way.
Sure. Yeah, as I understand the language, what it would say is that if there's some way that the federal government qualifies or describes marriage, then the state would construe that to mean treating spouses of the same sex in the manner as spouses of opposite sexes, line 4.10 and 4.11. I guess the problem is breadth in the sense that, as you imply, this doesn't refer to any specific subject matter, benefits, taxation, spending, anything like that, and it's better to take care of those in more of a pinpoint kind of fashion than it is to just broadly say that wherever there's a conflict, no matter where it might be, this language applies. It's too broad.
Representative Holberg.
All right. I appreciate the information because I wasn't even sure exactly. I mean, it read to me that no matter what the feds decided in Minnesota, marriage would be what we say, and I'm not so sure we even have the authority to do that. But
is that it, Representative Holberg?
I think
Representative Simon, did you have anything else? Any other comments? Okay.
I think maybe Representative Uruso is trying.
Representative Uruso?
Well, I was just going to comment that since what the amendment does is delete that whole bit, then we really don't need to quibble about what the whole bit would have done because it's not there anymore.
Well,
Representative Holberg.
that's okay. It's been a long day, Mr.
It has
Chair.
been, Representative Holberg.
I was just trying to understand the language, and if it comes back in some other form, what the original intent was. So words matter around here. And I had, if I might.
Go ahead, Representative Holberg.
The other thing that I'm struggling with, and I, believe it or not, spent a couple hours this afternoon actually watching the Senate hearing on this bill, and I know, I'm sorry, but maybe raised more questions. But there was quite a discussion around the Minnesota Human Rights Act and the strength of that. And there were concerns expressed about if an individual's religious belief was one that did not support a same-sex marriage. And in the bill as written, we have a carve-out for nonprofits. But what the ramifications were for, say, business owners that provided services. We have heard testimony, at least the Senate did today, and there's been stories in the news of, say, a company that provides a catering service or a floral service under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. What would be their rights for religious objection should this bill pass?
Representative Clark.
Mr. Chair, maybe I'll start by saying that this bill doesn't expand or contract in any way the protections that are already in the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So those discussion, I was there for part of the Senate hearing too, I didn't hear it all. But I think the answer over and over was, what we're talking about in this bill has to do with marriage, not with any changes to the existing protections against discrimination for businesses or the religious exemptions for religious organizations that are in the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Those are intact. We're not changing that. So a lot of that discussion was kind of about an issue that really isn't before us. What we're really talking about here is the marriage, a change to the meaning of marriage, not to the Minnesota Human Rights Act.
And, Mr. Chair,
Mr. Holberg.
I understand that, but as I listened to the testimony and looked at the language of the bill, if it was true that nothing changed and religious protections were still the same, then the language regarding the nonprofits in the bill would not be necessary either. And so I'm trying to have a better understanding of, we have language in the bill for nonprofits. I think it's trying to get at the church issue, private schools, et cetera. And so if under the current Minnesota Human Rights Act, those organizations have protections for religious freedom, if you will, then why the need for that language? I don't have a clear understanding of, if we need this language for nonprofits, where does the for-profit sector of the state stand relative
Clark.
to being able to assert a religious objection to providing a service in the marketplace? Or do they have no standing to do that?
Representative Clark.
Mr. Chair, and I'll answer the best I can, and then maybe we could ask for one of our lawyerly persons to explain a little bit more. But here's my understanding. Again, the Minnesota Human Rights law, the existing law right now, does tell us what for-profit businesses, and that's what you're asking about, can or cannot do. That's not changed. What we are doing by adding this language here is just to, I think, be really, really clear about the religious exemptions and what it covers. And that was, there's two places where that happens, and that was done on the relationship to the law, rules of construction, religious freedom, the Human Rights Act, and we also did it on the part that you just mentioned, actually the refusal to solemnize protecting the right of religious organizations not to have to marry, if that's against the religion. So maybe I should ask maybe one of our people who have crafted this language. I wonder if Mr. Carpenter would come forward.
And Mr.
Representative
Chair,
Holberg.
Representative Clark, I understand that we're not changing the Human Rights Act, but we are changing the definition of marriage. And so that adds a different question. If you are, say in the case of Vermont, somebody that provides catering services for wedding receptions, or the case of the florist, right now that issue isn't before them because there isn't a marriage that they have a religious objection to having legal status in Minnesota. That right now. So that's not a situation that presents themselves to a for-profit Minnesota business person. If the bill is passed, we change the definition of marriage, and as everyone in this room is very aware, there are some very deeply held religious beliefs around definition of marriage. In the Senate, there was an imam that testified. The structure of the Senate hearing was quite a bit different, but a number of people testified about deeply held religious beliefs that I think have some protection in the Human Rights Act of Minnesota. But if you could talk a little bit to the extent or not that extends to the public marketplace.
Representative Clark.
Well, I'll just say my understanding is that if a business is offering a public service right now under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, if they're offering a business product, they are not allowed to discriminate on a number of bases: race, religion, age, disability, gender, sexual orientation, and status according to public assistance. So those things continue to be prohibited by any business, so in the marketplace. So we haven't changed that.
And, Mr. Chair,
Representative Holberg.
I understand that. I mean, I know that if this bill passes and I'm an employer, and if I don't want to offer insurance benefits to same-sex couples, I'd have to remove insurance benefits for all employees because you can't discriminate. It's either all in or all out. I'm talking about providing a service relative to the marriage event in which I say, I have a religious objection to same-sex marriage. And as such, I don't want to prepare flowers, or I don't want to cater an event, or I don't want to be the photographer. We heard testimony in the Senate about, another example was medical, offering medical treatment. Now, that's not directly related to the marriage ceremony itself, but various professionals that have a deeply held religious conviction that does not support same-sex marriage, are they able to assert that religious objection and refuse a service related to same-sex marriage and have protections under the Human Rights Act of the state of Minnesota?
I tried to explain it, but I don't think I explained it very well, so maybe I can ask Mr. Carpenter to
Mr. Chair, I
weigh in on
think
this.
I'm trying to maybe get Mr.
Okay,
Carpenter to
Mr. Carpenter,
talk.
please introduce yourself for the record.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Dale Carpenter, and I teach at the University of Minnesota Law School constitutional law and the First Amendment, including religious freedom. So it's an issue of great importance to me. The marriage bill that you have in front of you today does not provide a cause of action of any kind for a person based on the fact that they have just been married. There is no provision in the bill for enforcement or remedies or anything like that for discrimination. So to the extent there is any legal liability, it would have to come out of the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which in one form or another, as you know, has existed for many decades. About 20 years ago, we added sexual orientation. So that's where we start. And then the analysis under the Act would start with what sorts of entities are covered, in what situations are those entities liable legally for various kinds of discrimination, what kind of discrimination is it, and then even if you pass all of those tests, you have to ask questions about whether there are exemptions for that particular kind of entity. And the Minnesota religious freedom exemptions are among the most generous in the country in an anti-discrimination law. What's interesting about that, and it can be a very complicated discussion, obviously, what's interesting about that discussion is none of it is affected in any way by the marriage bill. So that, for example, a couple who is simply having a commitment ceremony could go to the wedding photographer today or to the cake baker and be refused a service and potentially have a claim under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. The fact that they're married or not doesn't make a difference to the outcome of their lawsuit under the Human Rights Act. The analogy that I would draw is to the New Mexico wedding photographer's case, which you may have heard about. In that case, of course, New Mexico has no recognition of same-sex marriage. And there was a claim that a photographer refused to photograph a commitment ceremony for a same-sex couple. They sued under the New Mexico law, and that is still being worked out in the courts in New Mexico. It's a very complicated issue. The most direct precedent we have on point about this particular question that I think you're asking about those who are in the for-profit business, so we're not talking about religious entities or non-profit religious entities, but in the for-profit world who have religious and other objections to various services, is probably a case called McClure versus Sports and Health Club, which was decided by the Minnesota Supreme Court in 1985, before we had sexual orientation coverage in the state. And in that case, the Minnesota Supreme Court, held that the sincerely held religious beliefs of the owners of a place of public accommodation did not permit them to disregard the requirements of the Minnesota Human Rights Act once they chose to enter the marketplace. That's been the law in Minnesota now for going on something at like 30 years, at least according to the Minnesota Supreme Court. That's not affected one way or another by this bill.
Representative Holberg.
Mr. Chair, I think it is in that you're changing the definition of marriage that may be contrary to some people's religious beliefs. I mean, the underlying issues, I agree, aren't changed by this, but so is it fair then to surmise you could have a situation where you have two parties in a lawsuit in the state of Minnesota, both asserting protections under the Human Rights Act, one being the right to marry under a sexual orientation, and one being religious, deeply held religious belief, and they then having to sort those out?
Professor Carpenter.
Yes. Those kinds of conflicts have come up in other states in the country where there's a claim under a state human rights law that there's been discrimination. The defendants defend with some exemption in the state law. Barring that, they defend with a constitutional protection claim, and those are being worked out. I've actually filed a brief in the New Mexico photographer's case supporting the religious freedom of this wedding photographer, against probably what some of my allies would prefer, but that's what I've done. But Minnesota law stands on its own base. There are constitutional freedoms. They have not generally applied to for-profit businesses, although I've argued that in some cases they probably should. That'd probably be a subject for a very long and interesting constitutional law seminar. But it's not something that this bill resolves either way. I take your point that we're talking about marriage and a status that has implications under some 500 statutes in Minnesota. That's definitely the case. Those provisions in Minnesota law, however, provide rights for individuals as against their government, not as against private entities. And this bill seeks to make it clear that citizens in Minnesota, if they make the commitment to each other as against their government, cannot be discriminated against on this basis.
Representative Holberg.
If I might, can you then explain, maybe with some greater detail than we've heard thus far, if in fact you believe that there are already these protections for religious freedoms, why the language in the bill spelling out the nonprofits, why the necessity for that?
Professor Carpenter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe there are about 4 different places in the bill where there's some discussion of religious exemptions or freedom, depending on how you count the provisions. I believe those provisions do one of 2 things, and in some cases both things. Either they reaffirm that nothing has been changed in existing law and in protecting religious freedom in this bill, or they, to some extent, make it even clearer, or you could say even expand to some extent the degree of religious freedom that's provided in the bill to make it absolutely clear that with respect to ceremonies, for example, there will be no requirement that religious institutions provide their facilities, their faith is protected, and so on. If there was any doubt about that, we wanted to make sure that, I think the authors of the bill wanted to make sure that that was clear. So I think it was a matter of clarity and reaffirmation.
Representative Holberg.
Mr. Chair, I'll defer to others for a while here.
Thank you. Other comments from members? Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this has been, thank you for conducting a fair hearing, Mr. Chair. And I want to say that, you know, I'm disappointed that we're even taking up this divisive issue and we don't have the budgets done here. And this is an issue that is very divisive, as we've heard testimony today. And additionally, the people of Minnesota were told this past fall and summer that if a no vote would mean that there would be no change in the statute, and here we sit trying to change the statute. And also in light of the recent polling with the Star Tribune that barely a third of the people in the state of Minnesota are in favor of changing the statute. I'm just I'm troubled that we're here at all, but I just want to thank you again for running a very, very fair hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Scott. Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I echo the sentiments of Representative Scott here. I spent my afternoon, for those that don't know, I'm a freshman, and I'm new to this committee, and it's a privilege to serve here. I wanted to be up to speed on this whole issue. So I spent my afternoon watching civil law tapes from 2 years ago and Ways and Means tapes on this exact argument when it was the constitutional amendment was being forwarded. And I want to echo some sentiments here, and I'm trying to understand this. At the time, we had some very senior members whom are on this committee that I respect. I really do. If you go back to May 2nd, 2011, House File 1613, watch the tapes, especially the last 30 minutes. You can reference what I'm talking about here. But at that point, we were trying to, through House File 1613, trying to further define marriage. And the comments that were made from people that I highly respect were we're wasting our time on this when we should be solving the budget issue. From another member who I highly respect at the same hearing said instead of balancing the state budget, we're having meetings on constitutional amendments. When I went to the Ways and Means Committee, watched that, there were 3 other very senior members who expressed the exact same sentiments. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get a basic understanding as to why is it different this time. This legislature is facing a budget, a lack thereof. We haven't even begun to address that, and yet we're now trying to wrestle through a very distinctive change in the very fundamental fabric of our society, yet we haven't even, I'm just going to take and put it on, I'm going to take it and just put it strictly from 2 years ago, what the argument was. So if we haven't even begun to tackle our budget issues, why is this at the forefront? And I just echo the words from the senior members from this committee who convinced me that the budget was a priority. You won that argument in my mind. So I sit here 2 years later after listening to some very well-crafted and very fine arguments, trying to figure out what makes it so different this time when we're facing the exact same dynamic. So I'm thinking out loud, and I'm just expressing that, and I just want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Representative Newberger. Comments from members? Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing I wanted to say before I answer Representative Newberger's question, because I have a feeling I might be one of those senior members who made those comments when we had that debate 2 years ago. But we heard a lot of testimony today, and some of the things that were said were factually wrong, medically wrong, legally wrong, historically wrong, biblically wrong. And, you know, I think out of respect for the testifiers, we let people express their opinions without saying the things with which we disagreed. But I just want to be clear that silence during the recitation of alleged historical facts that weren't true or alleged medical facts that weren't true doesn't mean the acquiescence to their truth. So I think that there were some things that were regrettable that were said. The difference, I would say, Representative Newberg, between this year and the last time this issue came up was this bill is going to the General Register where it will sit until the budget is done. We have a deadline for policy bills of March 15th, and this bill is respecting that process, and I think that's appropriate. The other thing is the Democrats didn't put this issue in front of the state of Minnesota. This issue came before the state of Minnesota because of the vote that happened on the constitutional amendment that was proposed. This was not an issue that Democrats running for office and Democrats wanting to take back the majority went out and raised as an issue. It was an issue that was raised by Republicans, put on the ballot, and now the issue is before us. I think the question has been called on equal rights. And the question for us, as the people in charge of the institution right now, is will we take up that issue of equal rights, and will we do the right thing? The third thing I'll say that's different is the bill that was before the committee 2 years ago was about taking away rights. This is about granting rights. The issue 2 years ago was arguably electioneering to try to have an outcome in the election that was favorable. We are taking up this issue at our peril. It's not for electoral advantage, and it may not work out that way. But the issue of equal rights is before us, and we're going to address it. To the merits of the bill, I'm a co-author. I'm proud to be a co-author. I don't think I need to say anything more about what a great bill it is.
Thank you, Representative Portman. Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. And sorry I had to miss part of the testimony this evening. As many people know, we are multitasking and we're in many different places at the same time. But I am very glad that I was here earlier in the day and got to hear all of the testimony in the earlier committee hearing. And as Representative Portman has alluded to, sometimes it was very difficult to listen to. And of course, we all heard a lot of extremely moving testimony in this committee as well. And the comment that I wanted to make in response to some of that is to remind people that when we're talking about marriage, that we're talking here about our civil institution, the state. The state doesn't sanctify anything. We are government. We don't sanctify anything. That is the job of religious institutions. All we do here in the state of Minnesota is create a legal status. We give people a bundle of rights. And that bundle of rights is what we call civil marriage in this context. That's what we're talking about here, civil marriage. I've been married quite a long time to my husband. We have a civil marriage that is recognized by the state of Minnesota. That is all we have. What religious aspect to that we have is really none of the business of any of the people sitting around this table. So I just want to make that very, very clear to the people who came and talked to us about their deeply held religious beliefs. And there was a dialogue here, too, with Representative Holberg and the people at the testifying table about deeply held religious beliefs and so on. And people can hold whatever religious beliefs they want to. But when it comes to the state of Minnesota, I believe that we have to treat everybody the same. And that means that when we give that bundle of legal rights that we call civil marriage, that we cannot discriminate against people on the basis of gender. And we have done that for far too long. So I also wanted to respond to the young girl hours ago who sat at that table. I think she was 11 years old, and in a very dramatic way asked us which of her parents she didn't need. And of course, we weren't responding. We were letting everyone testify. So we let her ask that question, and it went unanswered. But I want to answer her because she was asking the wrong question. It was really the wrong question, because this is not about that girl and her family. Because every child who has two parents, clearly they need both of their parents. And if they have a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or whoever is in their family, clearly those people have great meaning to them. But families are not all the same. And I think just as that girl was saying, which of her parents didn't she need? That was a very unfair question. But I think that gay and lesbian citizens of this state are also asking us a question here. And their question is, why should my family be any less valid than your family? And my answer is, there's no reason, and it's time for that to end.
Thank you, Representative Liebling. Comments from members?
Sure.
Representative Holberg.
I'm sorry, I have another question on another issue on the bill, and I think this one will be a little easier and a little quicker.
Go ahead, Representative Holberg.
It's related to the language on page 4, lines 12 through 15. And in the state of Minnesota, if a couple is unmarried the physical and legal custody goes to the mother unless there's a court order otherwise. And that's something really important, especially to young single mothers. And I want to, at least for the record, make sure that it's not your intent to change that standard with this bill.
Professor Carpenter.
I would not read this language to change that standard, but I would defer to the authors of the bill and the sponsors to do so. It's not my...
Right, and
Representative Holberg.
the language that in particular concerns me, where it says, including those that establish parentage presumptions based on marriage, because in the case of unmarried mothers, and this affects, from what I understand, nearly half of all births in Minnesota right now are to unmarried mothers, that we provide that they have legal and physical custody. And I don't think that we should inadvertently change that by some broad rules of construction language in another area of law.
Thank you, Representative Holberg. The comments? Were you
Well,
requesting an
again,
answer from a specific member, Representative Holberg?
I'm not a lawyer. There's plenty of them on the other side of the table here.
Any lawyers
Staff,
want to
I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in on this, if we need more language to make sure that that's not the case, or...
Next time you'll have to set the hook, Representative Holberg. Is there anyone that cares to comment on that? Well, maybe we'll come back around on that, Representative Holberg. But for now, we're going to move on to other members, unless you have another question.
I don't. I just
Okay.
want to make sure that we're not inadvertently changing that standard, because I think it would cause a lot of problems.
Understood. Give us one moment, Representative Holberg. I think we may have an answer. Professor Carpenter?
Well, the language, again, it's not my reading of the bill to do that. I'm in agreement with you about that. The language that I think you just pointed to is at lines 13 and 14 in the bill on page 4.
And if I might...
Representative Holberg?
Right.
Responsibilities of spouses or parents under the laws of the state, including those that establish parentage presumptions based on marriage. What I believe the design of this is, and what I believe this accomplishes, is that it's common in the law when a child is born to a married couple that the couple is presumed to be the parents of the child, and that's what this is an attempt to address in the context of same-sex couples, ensuring that that child has two legal parents and not just one. So in a way, it's designed to address the very problem that I think you're discussing, which is we don't want children to end up having only the single legal parent.
Representative Holberg?
Mr. Chair, I understand the need for that language in your bill, but in addition to presenting the issue of unmarried mother, and I'm really concerned with these young moms that dad may be long gone and not good situations. Right now, I think it's not perfect, what the standard is around that works. In the case where they're not married, and maybe this is your intent, you also would, with this language, have unmarried, so then you'd have unmarried same-sex couples that could sign parentage agreements like we do right now with, a lot of times, the fathers will sign a parentage agreement in these unmarried situations in the hospital to establish parentage.
Professor Carpenter?
I don't know
Sorry,
that these
go
are
ahead.
issues we're going to solve here tonight, but I'd like somebody with some family law expertise to make sure that we accomplish that which you want to do, that you have gender-neutral language around children of same-sex marriage, but not have inadvertent consequences for children of unmarried couples in the state of Minnesota.
Mr.
Chairman.
Professor Carpenter, if you're able to just connect with Representative Holbrook offline after the hearing, that would be helpful.
Mr.
on that.
Chairman.
Representative Clark.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I'm very interested in us addressing your issue, so let's plan to do that.
Thank you, Representative Holbrook. Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not sure if this is going to be off message or not, but I want to disagree a little bit with Representative Liebling, actually, and Representative Hortman. I think that we are addressing this question today because it is a moral question. It is written in law that we have to address because the views of society and the views of people who care about marriage and who care about families are changing very quickly. We, as a state government, have created a privilege and a right in marriage. And I think most of us would agree that the right to marry is an essential liberty. We face this question whether it's before the budget is passed, after the budget is passed. You did not, I don't think, hear me, Representative Newberger, say that we shouldn't address these questions because I think we need to. And the question is whether we should include everyone who has all the characteristics of a traditional marriage in commitment, love, caring for each other, possibly a resolution to become boring with time, which is something that happens to married couples. All of those characteristics of marriage and all the character that goes into making a marriage work. Those people who have those characteristics and that character for marriage, whether they should be included or not. And they're not, but for one immutable characteristic. And I think that's the moral question before us. Just, as I think about it, the traditional arguments or the traditional sentiment against including same-sex couples in marriage fall along the lines of kind of moral questions of sanctity, authority, loyalty, and the question of harm. And I think all those questions have really been resolved in favor of including those people who are so far not included. The harm to families who are not able to have protection of marriage, I think, is very clear, and I think was very amply demonstrated today and is throughout the last campaign and through the last several years. The harm is real. The question of sanctity and whether this is an institution or a relationship or an arrangement that is somehow sacred, I think that is made sacred by the commitment of two people. I think it is made sacred by the inclusion of children and the commitment to live life together. The question of authority, I think for a long time religious authority was fairly unified in its belief that marriage should not exist between people of the same sex. I think that religious authority has dramatically changed its views, and I think we fool ourselves if we do not think that as legislators and as a state government we don't legislate morality based on the authority of religious organizations. We do because it reflects the sentiments of our constituents. But I think that authority of religious organizations has changed and is frankly very mixed today. And one of the last things I would consider one of the moral tests is loyalty. And we don't talk about that a great deal. But it's loyalty to people within a group, people in a community. And to me, passing marriage equality is about welcoming families that exist, the families that are out there. It's welcoming them fully into our community and demonstrating the loyalty of Minnesotans to them as they would demonstrate to us, I think, if the question were reversed. And so I do think it is fundamentally a moral question. We're going to disagree on where that comes down based on moral views, but to me, the morality of it is very clear. I strongly support it. And Representative Clark, I'm very proud to be here with you today.
Thank you, Representative Winkler. Representative Johnson.
Mr. Chair. Professor Carpenter, I just want a short question on back on the issues that Representative Holbrook had a little while ago that I was never able to hear an answer. So I'm going to put in a hypothetical situation. Let's say I own a catering business, and due to my religious beliefs, I could not, in good conscience, have my catering service, provide the service at a wedding of a same-sex marriage just because of my religious beliefs. Under the current Minnesota law, would I be sued?
Professor Carpenter.
Under current Minnesota law, without the marriage bill passing, if a couple came to you seeking your business, they would have to file suit under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. They would have to find a provision that applied to your business. Then they would have to establish that they fit within the definitions of the statute. Then we'd have to determine whether there was an exemption that applied. Under the precedent that I read earlier, I think the Minnesota Supreme Court has said, in interpreting the statute long before sexual orientation was added, that when you enter the marketplace, you are subject to the rules of anti-discrimination. It's a decision that we as a society made about a century ago, that when you enter the marketplace, you are subject to certain rules that you provide services to the public. That is common throughout the United States. And if you could be sued at all, you could be sued today without the marriage bill passing. So I hear legitimate concerns in your question. There's no doubt about that. Those questions, I think, are best aimed at the Minnesota Human Rights Act itself and could be considered in a proposed amendment to the Minnesota Human Rights Act or some other bill, but they're not. There's nothing that this marriage bill changes in the result of that action.
Representative Johnson.
Mr. Chair, Professor Carlson, right now under Minnesota law, I would not be providing that service at a wedding. I could be providing that service at trying to think of the proper word here, a service where they're just performing their, or it's not a religious service, but just even a civil service, but it's not a religious service. But under this new proposed law, it'd now be a marriage. And would there be a difference? Yes, I'm looking for a simple yes or no answer.
I don't think.
Carpenter.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I don't think that I hope this is good. I don't think that the marriage bill makes a difference. So the answer would be no, it does not make a difference. I think that businesses, under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, businesses are subject to its provisions regardless of the service they're providing and regardless whether their objections are religious or not, if the statutory criteria are met and if you have engaged in a form of discrimination that is prohibited under the statute. There are about 14 categories of discrimination under the statute, including race, sex, sexual orientation, veteran status, and so forth. So someone hypothetically suing you would have to establish that they met the criteria for application of the statute, and this bill does not make a difference in that outcome.
Representative Johnson.
In my personal opinion, I believe it would. I know many, in fact, I have a number of friends and some relatives that live that lifestyle, and I love them dearly. But the difference is right now that I see is we're not doing a wedding ceremony at this time. By adding the wedding ceremony, now it's getting to a different level where it's changing the law and how that application is.
Professor Carpenter.
It may well make a difference to individuals who are defendants in these lawsuits who may object more to a marriage than a civil commitment or a civil union ceremony. Under the law, it doesn't change anything. The fact that you are married doesn't make a difference in the outcome of the claim that you make under the Minnesota Human Rights Act or under this bill. We've had tens of thousands of same-sex marriages performed in the United States as we sit here today, tens of thousands. Very few cases have actually arisen in which same-sex couples have sued for recognition of their marriages from a baker or florist, and nothing has turned in those lawsuits on whether they were married or not. It's simply a matter of previously existing anti-discrimination law. Minnesota has struck a balance in the past few decades. It has among the strongest protections for religious freedom in the country, but at the same time, it recognizes that people must be protected from discrimination in ordinary civic transactions when the discrimination against them is invidious.
Representative Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members. I had a choice of either talking about making it personal, telling my stories. As in my culture, we talk, and how we talk to our children and how we talk to each other often is through story. And but we don't have like 20 minutes for me to tell you my story. So I'm going more on towards the lawyer side and the activist and the advocate. And I was reading an article. It was a history of same-sex marriage. It was written by William Eskridge Jr. It was his Yale Law School, and it was part of a faculty scholarship series paper. So I'm going to sort of paraphrase from that, and so. This is what I was thinking about earlier, is that we have heard today that denying same-sex marriage relates not only to the belief that procreation is essential to marriage, but more deeply to fears of homosexuality, just as denying mixed-race marriage was related to deep-seated racial tensions. I believe that marriage is a social construct, and thus it is not and cannot be neutral. The social construction of marriage involves the playing out of power among various groups, as Representative Winkler stated, and that power often divides and oppresses. It should be evident from the testimony heard here today that marriage is dynamic. Because marriage is linked to other attitudes and institutions, including this institution, it will change as attitudes and institutions change. And the fact that I am here and part of this institution means that it already changed, and that many that sit to the left of me here who are here is evident that this institution has changed. And then I want to end with this statement, and that is sort of sums up what my life has been about, as not only as a lesbian but also as a American Indian, and something that is neither one is a lifestyle.
Please, understood. Please, no outbursts with respect to any testifiers or members of the committee who speak out of respect. Thank you. Representative Allen.
And again, this first sentence is paraphrasing. Institutions, including marriage, change when subordinated groups identify their oppression and resist it. And I am proud to be among those, along with Representative Clark, among those that resist it.
Thank you, Representative Allen. Representative Russo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. I'm a little bit hesitant to describe this as granting a right to people. Under the principles of our country, equal rights are supposed to be shared by all, and I really feel that what we would be doing is finally recognizing a right of some of our citizens. But I also want to speak to the business aspects of this. There are quite a number of businesses that would welcome the chance to capture the trade involved with marriages between same-sex partners. In my personal experience, I know a couple of young women who, tired of waiting for Minnesota, chose to get married in Iowa. And they were going to just go down there and get married and then come back and have the party. But they decided, Iowa deserved to be rewarded for that, so they had the whole party there. But since then, they have had to spend a lot of money in Minnesota. They've had to spend it on lawyers. Now, I know some of you are lawyers, so I'm like cutting into your business. But they've had to spend money to take care of their wills, which my husband and I finally got around to doing wills, but we didn't have to, because Minnesota state law sets it out pretty clearly what would have happened if either of us had died. And they've taken care of their advanced care directives, and we did finally get around to taking care of that, but we could drag our feet because Minnesota state law takes care of that pretty well for us. And they've recently had a young daughter, and they had to spend a couple $1,000s on lawyers and fees and whatnot. And we didn't have to do any of that. My husband was automatically granted parenthood of my 3 children. And he's never had to do anything for that. He's never had to talk to a lawyer. He's never had to file, it was automatic under the law. And so we take for granted, you've probably heard about the 515 things. But you have to realize those are not special things. Those are things that we take for granted. That all I had to do was fill out that marriage license and stand up in front of some people. And I got all of that, all at once, and along with it, a free name change.
Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've just been kind of mulling over in my head what Representative Hortman was saying, and I just need to make a point here, make this clear, that I spent the better part of this afternoon listening to the arguments of some of the finest legal minds I've yet to meet, and I'm not saying that to score brownie points. I've gotten to know you folks, and you're really smart. The point I'm trying to make is you convinced me 2 years ago. The dynamics, we're 10 weeks out from the end of the session, and we have yet to really see anything of a budget. And the dynamics really are, to me, they're the same. You guys convinced me 2 years ago, and I'm just not convinced that this is a different thing, and that the timing, the characteristics are all pretty much the same, and I just want to echo that, to let you know that 2 years ago, you're the ones that talked me into the whole timing issue, and I'm quite impressed. So I just want to thank you for that, and just to let you know that I'm not convinced that we're arguing 2 different things here. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Newberger. Representative Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I first want to say a word about what we've heard today about some of the religious liberty provisions in this bill. I think, looking at this bill, compared with the protections in place in other states that have already legalized same-sex marriage, this is one of the most, and quite possibly the most protective, even aggressively protective, bill in the country. You look at the categories that legal scholars on both sides of this issue look at when they're looking at religious protections, and you look at the language in this bill. This bill explicitly allows clergy and institutions to refuse to perform marriages. Not all states do. We would. This bill specifically allows religious organizations to provide goods or services related to the marriage ceremony. Not all states do. This bill does. So would we if this passes. This bill also says that religious organizations are defined very broadly to include faith-based social service agencies and other affinity-based organizations. Not every state does that. It's about half and half. This bill does. We would. And finally, there's even a separate provision in this bill that would allow religious organizations to do what they would in most circumstances when it comes to things like adoption or foster care or other social services. Not many states do that. Precious few. We do. We would if this passes. That really is, I think, a tremendous thing, and I think it strikes the right balance. And I hope, at least, given what I think are some very thoughtful and useful concerns expressed by members of this committee and ones that I take very seriously, I think that's something worth knowing and worth thinking about, that great care was taken in this bill to make sure as much as possible that religious liberty and religious freedom and freedom of conscience was protected. There may be other suggestions along the way, and I'm sure there are proponents that would be open to hearing those suggestions, but as it is right now, this is a very, very strong and very, very generous bill in those categories. Second, just a word about polling, because as we all know from either our own races or others that we've followed, or any contest in the public mind, be it election or anything else, the wording of the poll matters. And I too saw the Star Tribune poll, but I noticed that there's one word that appears to make a difference when I look at all the polls, including one that was flip-flopped, that came out from a private group about 2 days before the Star Tribune poll, and one that came out a little bit earlier this year, is that when you explain to people that it's civil marriage, like the kind you could get at City Hall, when you explain that it's a civil contract and civil marriage, then the support shoots up when they know that fact. And then the result gets flip-flopped, notwithstanding the Star Tribune poll. So I think, as we all know, it depends on how you ask the question. The other thing that I don't think really is in doubt is where the trend line is, where things are headed. And it doesn't take a statistician to show the tremendous, almost light speed movement on this issue in the last few years. Keep in mind, when I first got here in 2005, along with Representative Hortman, Representative Liebling, others in my class, the version of the constitutional amendment then, in 2005, only 8 years ago, some of which, and there are members in this room that voted for that, would have made unconstitutional not only marriages, but civil unions. It would have said not only are they illegal, they are unconstitutional, supreme law. Now I'm hearing that behind the scenes there may be even a strategy by opponents to embrace civil unions, lest we go to marriages. I mean, how times have changed. In 8 years, some of the same people are now almost hoping for civil unions so as to stave off marriage, when just 8 years ago, the constitutional amendment that we voted on, March 31st, 2005, go and look it up in the House Journal, that constitutional amendment said that civil unions, too, would be unconstitutional. So, you know, whether it's Laura Bush or Dick Cheney or a host of others from across the political spectrum, I think we know where this issue is headed historically. And then finally, just in terms of the nature of this bill, religiously or otherwise, you know, I've said about this bill, but others as well, that there are three basic types of policy bills that we pass in this place. Bills that forbid something, bills that require something, and then there's this happy middle ground, which is a bill that simply allows something. It's not telling anyone what to do. It's not telling anyone what they can't do. It's simply tolerating, permitting, and allowing two people to do something that they desperately, desperately want to do, and in the grand scheme of things is hurting no one. That's what this bill does. And I like to say that it's not just live and let live, it's live and let love. And that's what we ought to do.
Thank you, Representative Simon. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, you know, I look around this table and I don't see too many rural members. Representative Anderson and Mr. Newberger are from more rural from rural areas. And I don't have with me the map of Minnesota of the results of the marriage amendment. But most of the people sitting around this table were metrocentric. And the map of Minnesota, in some of these rural areas, the marriage amendment passed 60% or more. And I just don't want us to get ahead of ourselves here in this committee, because we have a large diversity of people in our membership. And they represent people too. And regardless of what the folks around this table who we represent, there are other people to take into consideration here. We have to take this bill very carefully. We have an entire state, much of which doesn't feel the same way as maybe some of the people around this table and around the people in the metro area. And I just wanted to be on record as saying that. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Scott. Comments from members? Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, I think that we have an obligation to lead on this issue. Minnesota needs to step up and lead. It is time we grant people the civil rights that they deserve. I encourage members to vote yes.
Thank you, Representative Hillstrom. Comments from members? Representative Clark. Representative Pamar.
Just real quickly, Mr. Chair, I know it's been a long day. I just want to first of all thank Representative Clark for all the work you've done on this bill. And I was in this body when we had the debate on DOMA, and I remember I got up on the House floor and my legs were shaking, but I so wanted to oppose that bill, and I so wanted to stand with you in solidarity. And to see how far we've come and to see how close we're getting, I'm just, I couldn't be more thrilled. And you know, we will deal with the budget. We will deal with the budget. By May 20th, we'll be out of here, or before. We'll deal with it. We know how serious that is. But we can deal with other issues, and the time has come. I just absolutely believe that with all my heart, and I would just like to echo what Representative Simon said. You know, we've heard about budgets, we've heard about morality, we've heard about religion, but, you know, when you listen to the testimony of some of the folks who've come here, that fundamentally what people are talking about is love. And why aren't we advocating that? Why aren't we embracing that? Why aren't we encouraging that? And we have the opportunity to do that today. And I know this isn't an easy issue for folks, and I've read all the emails, but this is the time, this is the year, this is the day. I hope that people can vote yes on this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Pamar. And Representative Clark, before your final comments, just a comment from the chair. Representative Newberger, I hear you on your comments and your concerns. I remember 2011, and I remember out of the 11 years now that I've spent serving in the legislature, out of 6 budget cycles, that was the one year where the bill deadlines were reversed to have fiscal deadlines happen prior to policy bill deadlines in an effort to spur discussion and make things happen on the budget. It also resulted in a government shutdown that summer. There was no budget passed. There was no budget resolution prior to the time we moved on to talking about social issues. In this case, we have the same rules in place that we've had the other 10 years of my tenure, that being that policy bills occur first. So even now, as we speak, the governor is preparing a supplementary budget recommendation. That conversation is happening, but we are following the process here to ensure adequate discussion happens, and this doesn't fall off the table in the midst of all the wrangling towards the end of session. With respect to the issue, I want to thank you, Representative Clark, for bringing this forward. I abhor when religion is thrust into the midst of politics. I abhor it, but inevitably it happens. I consider myself a person of faith. I don't talk about my faith, but I do recall the faith leader about which I was taught growing up, Jesus Christ, who was attempted to be trapped by political issues, which he abhorred as well. And when he was attempted to be trapped, his response was, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. Members, we are not dealing with anything but, as stated, civil marriage here. I hope we can do that and bring fairness to the people of Minnesota. Representative Clark, final comments, and then we're going to take a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee members, each and every one of you. It's been an honor to be at this table and listen to your discussion, your concerns, and I've worked with many of you on many different aspects of state law, and this one is especially important, I think, because, as has been described so well by some of you, I'm not going to repeat your beautiful arguments and beautiful statements. This is a matter of civil marriage. This is a matter of honoring and granting respect to all of our families. And I wouldn't be bringing this bill forward if I didn't know that what it will do will be to strengthen Minnesota's families. It will really strengthen us. It will bring us together. I don't see it as a divisive issue. I see it as a unifying issue. I really think that's possible if we all put our hearts and minds to it. So I just ask you to support this bill, help people understand what's in it and what is not in it. There's myths that happen around any piece of legislation, so please help people understand that there's very strong religious freedom protections in here, very strong. And that was deliberate. We spent a lot of time listening to people who were concerned about that when we were putting this bill together. And I want to thank all the people who helped write this bill. Representative Simon, you were right there at the table quite a bit of the time. I want to thank you especially. But the community was heard. And I do ask that you vote for this bill. We can make Minnesota the 9th state in the union. We're not the first. The 9th, and if we're not in a big hurry and maybe we get our budget passed and everything first, we may be like the 11th, because there's 2 other states that are sitting right on the verge of passing this legislation too. So I just ask you to please support this legislation and, again, strengthen all of our families, strengthen our communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Clark. Representative Simon moves that House File 1054 as amended be recommended to pass and sent to the General Register. A roll call having been requested, the CLA will take the roll.
Chairman Lesch.
Aye.
Vice Chair Ellen.
Yes.
Representative Anderson.
No.
Representative Hillstrom.
Aye.
Representative Holberg.
No.
Representative Portman.
Aye.
Representative Howe.
No.
Representative Johnson.
No.
Representative Liebling.
Yes.
Representative Newberger.
No.
Representative Pamar.
Aye.
Representative Pugh.
No.
Representative Rosenthal.
Yes.
Representative Simon.
Yes.
Representative Scott.
No.
Representative Winkler,
Yes.
Representative DeRusso,
Yes.
Vote total being 10-7, motion passes. Members, there being no other business before the committee is adjourned.